For some analysis on this now, Alexey Muraviev joins me live from Perth in Australia. He's an associate professor of national security and strategic studies at Curtin University. Professor, great to have you here with us on TRT World. Since Donald Trump's return to the White House, both Washington and Moscow, they have more or less spoken with the same voice when it comes to Ukraine. And we have been seeing Moscow and Washington apply their strategy on Ukraine, which hasn't worked up until now. Do you think there is something different in the latest effort by Washington and Moscow?
I don't think there is a great degree of difference compared to what's been going on over the past few months. First of all, we need to understand that the dialogue between the Russians and the United States has been going on for quite some time, even if it hasn't been reported in open media. So a lot of the conversations that the White House is having with its Ukrainian counterparts as well as Europe is driven by the consequences of that ongoing dialogue with the Russians. And clearly the Russians are sort of holding their ground. They have the time. They are not wasting their time. They are gaining more ground in Ukraine, which obviously strengthens their negotiations position. But on the other hand, it all comes down to the way how these negotiations will be brought forward. And the Russians have been making it very clear they don't want to have a continuation of the discussion or an extension of the discussion being held in the public domain. And whenever the Russian officials have been asked about their position or their opinions, they simply say, this is for closed-door discussions. We are not going to disclose what we really want and what we really expect to get. So a lot of what media and some experts speculate about where Russian position is, because we're relatively clear about the U.S. position, is more or less based on guessing rather than informed analysis. So we should also have a degree of understanding that when it will come to negotiations with the Russians yet again, the landscape and the parameters of the so-called Ukraine peace deal may actually look different to the way how it's been discussed now.
Professor, we all know the reality is if tomorrow President Zelensky says, okay, I'm fine with ceding territory to Russia, this war will be over. But certainly that's not something that's going to happen. Zelensky has said time and again that he will not cede any territory to Russia. My question is, do you see any possibility of that happening in the future? Or in other words, what would it take for President Zelensky to agree to ceding territory?
Look, I mean, every war will come to an end. So clearly this conflict will end one way or another. The question is when and how. I think one of the core stumbling blocks is the status of Zelensky, which is being continuously questioned by the Russians. And I think Trump administration kind of accepted their narrative. That's why they're pressing Kyiv to hold presidential elections to legitimize Zelensky's current status in the eyes of the Russians, because the Russians are not going to sign the deal with a head of state they don't believe have legitimate authority. Then it also comes down to key terms of negotiations. There is a lot of talk about who is going to hold on the remaining parts of Donbass, but we don't really have an understanding of whether the Russians are actually in agreement not to progress with their demands for to have the whole control over Kherson as well as the Zaporizhia regions. I don't think the Russians will accept Zelensky's declaration that he is now ready not to see Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO, because it would require an amendment to the Ukrainian constitution since it's been written into it. And certainly the Russians are not going to settle on the idea that Ukraine can keep 800,000 strong army, which will make it by default Europe's large standing defense force, which will continue to be hostile to the Russians, and the Russians will simply not accept that. So there are obviously time parameters, there are these key clauses that I think would prevent the progression of the conversation. And it will always come down to how Zelensky will respond to it, because in the current situation, it is him who is currently under fire, and he is him who is actually picking up all the heat, because the United States doesn't have a lot of leverage to pressure Putin, and Putin is once again in the driving seat here. So this is the reality of the ground, and we need to understand it.
Fascinating insights. Alexey Muraviev, thanks very much for joining me here on TRT World. Appreciate your taking out the time.